Hello and welcome to week 8. Is that right? Is that possibly right? I guess it is right. Week 8 of this course. So we're really, I suppose, pretty much the halfway point. We not only start a new week with this video, but also an entirely new unit. So we are, in a sense, done with the Greeks, although we're not ever really done with the Greeks. And we're moving on to the Romans, and this entire unit, so the next 4 weeks, will be sort of all Romans all the time. And we're going to trace a very long arc in Roman history. We're going to start with the foundation of the city of Rome, traditionally in 753 BC or BCE, and we are going to end with the dissolution of the Roman Empire sometime around 500, very roughly speaking. So that's a long period. That's over a millennium. So we need to have some sense of how this time period is broken up into subdivisions. So this week we will cover the first subdivision, which is often referred to as early Rome, or the monarchical period. So that's 753 to 509 BC. So I'll be speaking to that today. Then we move into the period of the Republic, which is about 500 years in duration, 509 BC to, let's say, 31 BCE. And then finally, and I'll get to this in the next video, we'll be studying the Roman Empire, which spans from 31 BCE to 476 CE. So that's what we'll be looking at from a historical point of view. And really this week we are just focused squarely on history. We'll go on in later weeks to talk about Roman art and Roman literature and Roman religion and philosophy and so on. The big story that we are trying to track is how Rome goes from being a little series of villages in 753 BC to arguably the greatest empire the world has ever seen in the Common Era. How does that happen? And how does Roman culture change in the process? Because we always want to focus on culture here. But this week, again, the focus is going to be more on political, military history. So when we started our unit on the Greeks, I raised the question, what could possibly justify spending 1/4 of the course on the Greeks? Well, we have to ask the same question again, this time about the Romans. Why are we spending an entire unit, 4 weeks, on the Romans? I think that we can answer that. But the first thing to say is that the Romans are simply not as innovative, culturally speaking, as the Romans. So we talked about all the things that, not as culturally innovative as the Greeks. So we talked about all the things the Greeks kind of invented. Romans don't do a lot of that. They borrow very heavily from other cultures that they come into contact with. First the Etruscans, later the Greeks. But nonetheless, the Romans do forever change Western culture in terms of art, in terms of architecture, in terms of government and political structures. The Romans are still very influential even today. If you think about some of the terms that we use in politics all the time, the Senate, we talk about people as being dictators, maybe in other countries. The term governor, these are all words taken from the Romans. And that leads me to the next point. Another thing that we still very much have inherited from the Romans is language. Now, it's true that English is not a Romance language. That is, English is not a language that is derived directly from Latin. Nevertheless, English has absorbed, and we'll get to why later on in the course, but the English language absorbed thousands upon thousands of words that originated in the Latin language. So, like the word originate, for instance. So, that's another reason why the Romans are so important. Um, we've mentioned the Greeks. Another huge reason why the Romans are important is because the Romans absorb a great deal of Greek culture and then help to spread it far and wide. Now, we've already seen how Greek culture was spread mainly to the south and to the east in the Hellenistic period. The Romans are going to help export Greek culture sort of north and west to Europe. So that's a crucial function that the Romans provide. And finally, I have to mention the realm of religion. Christianity was born inside the Roman Empire, and before the Roman Empire collapsed, Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, which helps to ensure the kind of success that Christianity is going to have centuries and centuries later. So that just gives you some taste to begin with as to why the Romans might be worth your time. So what am I trying to do in this video, which I'll try to keep close to the 30-minute mark? I want to move from the foundation of Rome, 753 BC according to tradition, to right up to the crisis of the Republic in the late 2nd century BCE. So we're going to cover roughly 550 years, something like that. We've already looked at this period, but we've looked at it from the point of view of Greek culture, Hellenistic culture. Now we're going to be looking at the Romans. Now the Romans, in a way, not unlike Americans, the Romans love to tell stories about their early days, the early days of Rome. They have a number of different founding myths or legends that get told again and again and again. Now, these legends have very dubious historical value. In other words, we can't really, they're probably not very reliable guides to what actually happened. Nonetheless, these legends are important because they tell us a lot about the Roman people and the values they professed to have. So when I talk about these legends, as I will in just a moment, that's the question to ask. Why would the Romans tell these stories about themselves? What were they trying to communicate about their cultures, about their values? Again, Americans, we do this. We tell stories that probably have no historical basis. You know, the story of George Washington and the cherry tree, for instance. Why do we tell these stories, even if we kind of know they're probably not true, or at least historical? Well, because they're meant to say something about the American character. And these Roman legends work in the same way. The earliest myth about the founding of Rome is the story of Aeneas, A-E-N-E-A-S, Aeneas. Next week, we're going to be reading chunks of the Aeneid, which will tell the story much more fully. For now, all you need to know is that Aeneas was a Trojan who fought in the Trojan War. Of course, the Trojans lost that war to the Greeks. So he ends up having to leave his homeland, and he eventually finds himself in Italy, in the region of Latium, L-A-T-I-U-M. And even though he doesn't found Rome himself, he is seen as the founder of the Roman people. His descendants would go on to actually found the city of Rome. Now, again, why would the Romans cling to a story like this, a story which has very little historical value? Well, think about it. This story gives the Romans a connection to the Greeks. The Romans are separate from the Greeks. The Romans are not descended from the Greeks. But the Romans go a long way back with the Greeks, right? Because they fought against each other in a war. Of course, the very fact that the founder of the Roman people is a great warrior is significant. Because if there's anything that the Romans really excel at, it is going to be the art of war. And part of this story also talks about how a number of different refugees, people fleeing various sorts of calamities, come to um, come to Italy. Aeneas welcomes them, and that's meant to say something about how Romans are inclusive, that they're not chauvinistic. They don't think that non-Romans are worthless, barbarians, but they are willing to welcome people of different ethnicities into their community. Now, there's another really important story about the actual founding of the city of Rome, and it involves these two brothers named Romulus and Remus. Now, you're going to read about this, but um, by the way, one clue that this story is probably not terribly historical is the name Romulus simply means the Roman. Okay, so it's not likely an actual individual. So, to back up a little bit with this story begins with a king named Numitor. Numitor has a younger brother, and Numitor is a king in the region of Latium. He has a younger brother named Amulius, Amulius. And Amulius is going to drive his older brother out of town. He is going to turn against him and expel him from the city. Meanwhile, Numitor, the expelled king, has a daughter. And that daughter, of course, represents a threat to Amulius, because if that daughter were to have an heir, a male heir, that could endanger Amulius's position of power. So, and by the way, this story is going to be later on connected with the story of Aeneas, because Numitor, the exiled king, and Amulius are claimed to be descendants of Aeneas. Okay, so there is a connection that's made later. These stories were probably initially independent. So, Amulius needs to deal with this daughter, this niece of his. So he doesn't kill her, but he makes her a Vestal Virgin. Vestal virgins were Roman priestesses. They were priestesses of the goddess Vesta. And as part of the deal, if you became a Vestal virgin, and you would serve for 30 years at a time, but you would take a kind of vow of celibacy, that you would not have sexual relations during that time. Now, this plan doesn't really pan out for Amulius, because what happens is Mars, the Latin god of war, rapes the daughter. I won't even give you her name, just so I won't overwhelm you with names. But he rapes Numitor's daughter, and she gives birth to twins, and those twins are, of course, Romulus and Remus. Now, she needs to get rid of them because she doesn't want them to be killed by Amulius. But Amulius finds out about what happened, and Amulius has the twin babies thrown into the river. But they're floaters. They float down the river a while. They wash up onto shore. They are on the brink of death, but then they are suckled by a she-wolf. A she-wolf gives them her milk, and then eventually they're discovered by a shepherd who raises them. They will go on, these twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, will go on in the year 753 BC to found a new city, the city of Rome. But there's a weird sort of postscript to this story, which is that Romulus kills his twin brother Remus. The reason is not entirely clear. According to one tradition, the reason is because they had sort of marked out the city walls, and Remus jumped over the wall, and for that transgression, Romulus had Remus killed. Okay, so that's the story. Now, that's a very strange story to tell about your city, right? I mean, if there was an American city that had a story like that behind it, you probably wouldn't find the Chamber of Commerce loudly telling the story. But the Romans did. They loved this story. They thought the story was great. So why? What were they trying to communicate about themselves? Well, let's think about this. Romulus and Remus. Who is their father? It is Mars, the god of war. That's going to tell you something about the Roman people. They are warriors. What to do with the fact that they were suckled by a she-wolf and then raised by a shepherd? I think this is to suggest that Romans are not soft. They are tough people. They live close to nature. They don't wallow in luxury, that sort of thing. I think the story is also to suggest that the Romans highly value chastity in their women. So the daughter of Numitor as a Vestal virgin represents that. The fratricide bit is puzzling, right? Romulus killing Remus. But perhaps it's meant to say something about how seriously they take law. And really, this is one aspect of Roman culture that's been almost more influential on Western culture than anything else, and that is Roman law. So, Remus transgresses the law. He goes beyond the boundaries of the city, and his brother punishes him. Even though it's his brother, he punishes him because the law must be observed. So that's what you have to do with these stories, these myths that the Romans like to tell about themselves. Even though all that's sort of mythological and legendary, we are pretty sure that the city of Rome took some kind of shape around the 8th century BC. And initially, Rome was a monarchy. There was a king. The king had massive power, the power of imperium, I-M-P-E-R-I-U-M. This is the power to sort of make a command and have it carried out, the power to inflict corporal or even capital punishment on those who violate the law. So the kings were very powerful, but their power was not absolute because even at this period there was a senate. We'll talk more about the Roman Senate later. There was a senate even then, a kind of body of aristocratic elders who would give counsel to the king that the king was supposed to take quite seriously. Now, moving on into the 6th century BCE, the Romans find themselves ruled by Etruscan kings. The Etruscans were people that lived just to the north of Latium, where Rome is located. And I've already mentioned this, but Etruscan culture was highly influential on Roman culture, so you'll want to look for that as you read. What are some of the ways in which Etruscan culture left a kind of permanent imprint on Roman culture? So the Etruscans are going to rule the city of Rome for some time. Something very decisive happens, supposedly again in 509 BC. That's the traditional date. And according to this date, there is a revolt against the Etruscan monarch. The revolt is prompted by the rape of a very well-born Roman matron named Lucretia. So you're going to read about this in West in the World. Again, very hard to separate fact from fiction here, but it's one of those stories, I think, that even if it is entirely fiction, is a story that was important to the Romans because it communicated Roman values. Of course, one of those values is going to be chastity and purity in women. But in any event, there is some kind of revolt against the monarchy that takes place, and it's successful. And so what is implemented in the city of Rome is a republican form of government. Now, so far in this course, I haven't really talked about republic. So let me offer a definition of what a republic is. The word republic is itself a Latin word. It's actually a Latin compound word. The two words that together make up the word republic literally mean, in English, public matter. So a republic is a state in which the state belongs to the public, to the people. The state is not the private possession of one person, like a king. So by definition, a republican is not a republic rather, is not a monarch. And I'll give you a definition from the Oxford English Dictionary just to give you something to latch onto. A republic could be defined as a state in which the supreme power lies with the people or the people's representatives. Now, some people even today want to make a kind of strong distinction between a republic and a democracy. If you define democracy narrowly to mean a direct democracy, which is what we saw in ancient Athens, then you can make a distinction, because republics don't have that kind of direct democracy. But most people, I think, now define democracy more broadly. That would include more indirect forms of democracy. And if you have that broader definition of democracy, then you can say that, yes, republic is one form of democracy as well. Now, I'm not going to talk at all about the inner workings of the Roman Republic, how the government was set up, because you're going to watch a lecture from me on that topic. So look for that, and I don't have to say anything more. I will have, there will be a diagram of some of the offices of the Roman Republic and how they work together. In fact, there's going to be several handouts that are available to you for this week. So I urge you to go into Canvas and probably just print out, at least download those handouts. There's a timeline, a diagram, I believe a map too. So look for those handouts. So I'm not going to talk about the government. I want to talk a little bit about society, though, which is indirectly connected to the government. One of the big social developments in the Roman Republic is the struggle of the orders. At the beginning of the Republic, there are two main social ranks in Rome. There are the patricians, so these are the nobility, usually quite wealthy, but not always. But certain families would be considered patrician because those families were thought to, they could trace their lineage all the way back to the original Romans, to first generation Romans, sort of like, Americans today in New England who can trace their ancestors back to the Mayflower or something like that. So those are the patricians. Everybody else would have plebeian status. Okay, plebeian, P-L-E-B-E-I-A-N-S, plebeians. Plebeians were actually a fairly diverse lot. Most of them were relatively poor, but some were actually fairly wealthy. So these are the two social classes. Everybody falls into one of these two groups at the beginning of the Republic. And at the beginning of the Republic, the patricians had a almost total monopoly over the political and religious life of the Republic. So the Roman Republic in its original form was a republic by patricians for patricians. But there are a lot of plebeians, and some of these plebeians have some money, some have some clout, and so they are going to very quickly begin to work toward full legal and social equality. And it's that struggle that historians today call the struggle of the orders, the two orders being plebeian and patrician. This is not a civil war. This is not a violent struggle. This is a social and legislative and legal struggle. So you'll be reading about that. It plays out over the course of several centuries. But by the time you get to sort of the middle of the Roman Republic, mid-3rd century BCE, by that point, at least in theory, at least in law, plebeians have equal status as patricians. So that's something that's sort of going on within Rome. I also want to alert you to some of the big developments that are happening outside the city of Rome. Because, of course, one of the big questions, as I've already said, for this whole unit is how does Rome go from being a small village to a global transcontinental empire? How does that happen? Well, it starts happening pretty quickly, actually. So, starting in 460 or so, there's a series of wars on the Italian peninsula, so that Rome is going to gradually conquer various regions in Italy, so that by the time you get to about 265 BC or so, Rome has political domination over pretty much the whole Italian peninsula, at least below the Po River. And as always, I'd like you to have your West in the World book out, and so you might want to pause and look at page 111. Look at that map and get a sense of how Rome had expanded its sphere of influence. So take a look at that. Why is Rome doing this? That's something you've got to think about as you read. Romans are going to claim self-defense. They were going to say that, well, their neighbors were aggressive, and so they acted in self-defense. And just so happens that they then, won the war and then sort of ruled over their neighbors. But I think that there are other factors at work as well. Rome, of course, had a very strong and proud military, and one of the things that you could give soldiers as a kind of incentive was land. So the more land the Romans conquer with their army, the more land they can give to their soldiers. So you can see how this is a kind of interrelated development. One thing you should know about the way Rome went about conquest is that, unlike the Greeks, the Romans were pretty open to other cultures, other cultural and language groups. And so in the cases of a lot of the territories that are conquered there in Italy, the Romans would extend citizenship, full citizenship in some cases, to the conquered people. In other cases, maybe not full citizenship, but some rights, perhaps not the right to vote, but other kinds of benefits of being a Roman citizen. So they tried to have this policy of leniency and generosity toward the vanquished, toward the defeated. And I think that's part of the key to the Romans' success. All right. A couple of major wars you need to know about. The Punic Wars. There are 3 in all. The third is not terribly significant. The first 2 much more so. Punic Wars are wars between Rome and its great Mediterranean arch nemesis, Carthage, located in North Africa. First Punic War was fought between 264 and 241. And by the way, you can use that map on page 111 to find the location of Carthage. You can see it's just sort of staring across the Mediterranean Sea toward Rome. I'm sorry, I thought I heard my daughter. I have to kind of keep tabs on things sometimes when I'm doing this. So all the Punic Wars in the same way. I mean, that's, I think, the important thing to know, which is Rome is victorious and Carthage loses, and in the process, this is going to augment Rome's territory, so that Rome is now expanding well beyond the Italian peninsula and picking up territories in places like Spain and North Africa and so on. And I really just don't have time to say much more at all about those wars. But again, the first and second ones are the really important ones. There is a third Punic War, and the only thing you need to know about that is that in that war, Carthage is utterly destroyed. The city is just leveled to the ground. It will be rebuilt later as a Roman colony, but the old Carthage is no more. Why does this war matter, in addition to the fact that it is going to gain territory for the Romans? And I should say at this juncture that this is not the only war that the Romans are fighting kind of in the middle of the Republican period. They're also fighting wars in Macedonia, not only fighting wars, but winning wars in Macedonia. So what are some of the important consequences of these wars? Expansion of territory, obviously. Okay, so Rome is now going to rule over parts of Greece and Macedonia. But this is also going to have other kinds of social and cultural ramifications. So there's a massive influx of slaves into Rome and Italy more generally at this time. After the Second Punic War, more than 200,000 prisoners of war are brought to Italy as slaves. And I think this is a really staggering statistic. By the 1st century BCE, scholars think that somewhere between 35 and 40% of the total population on the Italian peninsula were slaves. Okay. So in some ways, this is a kind of slave society. Maybe not quite to the same degree as the antebellum South in America, but to a considerable degree. Another major ramification pertains specifically to the Macedonian Wars. During these wars, that Rome will more fully and directly confront Hellenistic culture than it ever has before. And Hellenistic culture is going to profoundly transform Roman culture to the point that we commonly talk today about Greco-Roman culture. That tells you just how imbued with Greek culture Roman culture will become during this period. So we'll kind of leave the story around 200 BC, at which point the Roman Republic seems to be really firing on all cylinders. I've mentioned military successes. Of course, with military success comes new territory, comes wealth and riches. The Republic itself as a system of government is still functioning pretty well at this time. The Republican Constitution is generally honored during this period. But with all these military successes, seeds of future problems are going to be sown. So that's where we will pick up in the next video.